Today we are meeting again in our 5th lecture, okay? And today's lecture, after finishing one main genre of the English literature, اللي هو poetry, we move to a next genre, and that you may call, a sort of a subgenre of fiction, with its two kinds or different kinds of folk tales or fairy tales. Okay, we start with here folk tales, and as you see from the beginning on slide 1, you have the definition of the word folk tales. As you know, they are called a kind of stories passed from one person to another, okay, by word and mouth. The folk tales started in the oral form, as they started being told orally, and they move from one person to another, from one group of people to another, okay. Of course, these tales were not written down, they were just spoken, they were just orally, let's say, told from one group or one person to another, but existed, of course, the history, in terms of history, the folk tales existed, long time ago, okay, since in the middle of mankind, that's early, very early in the history of the human being. It is only now, okay, that the traditional oral storytelling is given way to books and generations. So, but as folk tales, being written in books, that is just something that we see in the modern days. Let's say early 19th century and on, 1800s and on. Then here we have folk tales that seek explanation the world around us. Here we have examples about tales and folk tales and their origin. Like the examples. Example number 1: why the sky is so high is one of the famous fairy tales, a folk tale from Bengal, India. Why the sea is salty, a folk tale from Karelia. Then for other folk tales often centered, around the favorite character types, like the miserly old woman, a folk tale from India. Then how the old woman got her wish, another folk from India. Then there are other folks that you need to remember. Okay, examples. Then we come to a second type of stories, part of this, fictitious genre, what is called a fairy tale. And compared to a folk tale, what is a fairy tale? A fairy tale is a type of short story, again, like folk tales, a type of short story that typically features folkloric fantasy characters such as fairies, goblins, elves, trolls, dwarves. They are almost of the same meaning, okay. لهم معنى الأقزام والجنيات والعفاريت والشياطين okay. هذه الشخصيات اللي كانت تستخدم في الحكايات والأساطير والخراريف اللي هي القديمة, okay. They are almost of the same types, stories that includes stories that include fairies, goblins, elves, trolls, dwarves, giants, mermaids, and gnomes, okay. And usually magic or enchantments, they imply and based on magic and enchantments. Fairy tales may be distinguished from other folk narratives such as legends, okay, which generally involve belief in the veracity of events described, and explicitly moral tales, okay, including beast fables, in what Okay, in less technical context, the term is also used to describe اللي هو fairy tales, something blessed with unusual happiness, as you know, in fairy tale ending اللي هي a happy ending. Fairy or a fairy tale romance, though not all fairy tales end happily, not يعني fairy tale colloquially, a fairy tale or fairy story can also mean, you know, a far-fetched story or tall tale. Okay. In cultures where demons, you know, witches are perceived as real, fairy tales may merge into legends. Okay, اللي هي الأساطير, where the narrative is perceived both by teller and hearers as being grounded in historical truth. However, you know, they usually fairy tales do not contain more than superficial references to religion and actual places, people, and events. They take place in fairy tales once upon a time. They don't have specific names and places in terms of setting. They usually talk about, general, people, general places, and even general time, not specific time, place, or characters. Once upon a time, okay, a king, a president, an old man, a poor man, a woman, an old woman, a beautiful woman, a young lady, okay, and so on. Okay, fairy tales are found in oral and in literary form, okay, just like the folk tales, okay, and in oral form. Okay, in oral form and in literary form. The history of the fairy tale is particularly difficult to trace, like many other, genres. There isn't a specific or exact, known time in history to say when they started. Still, the evidence of literary works at least indicates, okay, that fairy tales have existed for thousands of years. Okay, although not perhaps recognized as a genre, okay, they were not recognized as a genre by themselves, separate genre. The name fairy tale was first ascribed, okay, to them by Madame d'Aulnoy in the late 17th century. Then the older fairy tale was, this is of course here, as I said before, please you pay attention to the important, pieces of information. The older, the eldest, the youngest, okay, the most, the first, the last, okay, the most famous, okay. The older fairy tales were intended for an audience of adults, okay. يعني first, the fairy tales, just like the folk tales, were first intended for adults, okay, as well as children. But children used to also, watch or listen to these tales. So they were intended for an audience of adults as well as children. So there weren't fairy tales specifically written or told by, for children. Sorry. But they were associated with children as early as the writings of the Precious's, okay, the brothers Grimm titled their collection. Okay, this is an important name in children's literature. The brothers Grimm titled their collection Children's and Household Tales. Okay, and the link with children has only grown stronger with the time. Although the fairy tale is a distinct genre, okay, by itself, this within the larger category of folk tale. Okay, the category of folk tale is just the general genre, okay, and fairy tale is just part of it, comes under the folk tale genre. The definition that marks work as a fairy tale is a source of considerable dispute, not precise. One universally agreed upon matter is that fairy tales do not require fairies. So it doesn't mean because a story is categorized or classified as a fairy tale should include fairies, okay, or a fairy in it, okay, اللي هو بمعنى الفيري اللي هي بمعنى الجنية اللي هي حكايات الجنية أو الجنيات, okay. So it doesn't mean that a story a fairy tale should include fairies or a fairy. Okay. The history of the genre of the fairy tales, okay, originally stories that we would now call fairy tales were not marked as, as a separate genre. Okay, the German term Märchen stems from the old German word Ma. Okay, this is at least in what is, as I said before, please pay attention to this. Most probably information that is related to let's say names or titles that are not English, taken from other languages, will not be important for the exam, and even for the quizzes that you will have, or these assignments. The word Märchen is the diminutive of the word Mar, therefore it means a little story. Okay, the English term fairy tale, this is here just to tell the part of the definition. The English term fairy tale stems from the fact that the French contests often included fairies. That's why they often included fairies, but doesn't mean that every fairy tale has to have a fairy has to have fairies in it. Roots of the genre, fairy tales, come from different oral stories. So they were originally orals, like other, like the folk tales, and like many other forms of, literature, including, poetry. Stories passed down in Europe cultures. The genre was first marked, out by writers of Renaissance, such as Giovanni Francesco Straparola and Giambattista Basil. Okay, and stabilized. Okay, so this is also important. This definition of about the origin of the history, and stabilized through the works of later collectors such as Charles Perrault and brothers Grimm. Again, brothers Grimm. Okay, important name. And this evolution, the name was coined. Okay, Précieuses took the writing literary stories. Madame d'Aulnoy invented the term conte de fées or fairy tale. Okay, as I said, this is not important for the French names or German names. Okay, history here, the oral tradition of the fairy tale came long before the writing page. Okay, this is also here important to know about, the origin of and the history of fairy tales. Okay, as as a genre started or an art started orally before written pages. Tales were told or enacted dramatically rather than written down. Okay, they were not first written down, they were just told orally and handed down from one generation to another. Okay, passed on from one generation to another. That's how they received to us, and then they were written in the, let's say, early 19th and 18th century and on. Well, because of this, the history of their development is necessarily obscure. Okay, not known, it's vague, not clear. And fairy tales appear now and again in written literature throughout literature cultures, as in this example, the Golden Ass, which includes Cupid and Psyche. Association with children, fairy tales being associated with children. Originally, adults were audience of fairy tales. Okay, just often as children. So adults also used to listen to as an audience. Okay, adults were the audience of a fairy tale just as often as children. Literary fairy tales appeared in works intended for adults first. But in the 19th century and 20th century, the fairy tale became associated with children's literature more. The precious seas, including a name of a writer, including Madame de Aulnoy, intended their works, these two, for adults, but regarded their source as the tale that servants or other women of lower class who tell to children. So they used to like servants, okay, or women of lower class, listening or learning, fairy tales to tell, the children of the rich people, or to our children often who are, working for. Indeed, a novel that of that time depicting a countess's suitor offering to tell such a tale has the countess exclaim that she loves fairy tales as if she were still a child. Fables and fairy tales, okay, we have examples here of famous fairy tales. اللي هو the magic mirror. You have to remember, these examples. This list here is taken from a very long list, so I just shorten it and make it concise, just limited to these few names. So you have please to remember these names. The Magic Mirror, Jack and the Beanstalk. Jack and the Beanstalk is an important fairy tale, and it's a very famous one, okay? Jack the Giant Killer, the Golden Goose, etc. The fantasy genre, okay, after these two types, اللي هو folk tales and the fairy tales. Here we come to a third genre, or a different kind, or a third kind of folk tales, اللي هو fantasy genre. The events occur outside the ordinary laws, in these stories, or in this genre, stories of this genre, because they talk about stories that occur, that happen, outside the ordinary laws that operate within the universe. Okay, and they talk about abnormal things, and they discuss happenings, laws that do not exist. Okay. Within the world, okay, within our ordinary world, okay, events occur outside the ordinary laws that operate within the world, and they also include magic is central to the fantasy genre. And there is magic in almost every fantasy story you read. Fantasy stories often involve journeys and quests, looking for something, okay, trying to find, to discover. So these are three characteristics of fancy genre stories, or stories of fancy genre, اللي هو events occur outside the ordinary laws that operate within the universe. Magic is central to the fantasy genre, and fantasy stories often involve journeys and quests. Now, how does fantasy differ from science fiction and fairy tales? Okay. Science fiction stories also operate outside the normal boundaries of the real world. Of course, fantasy, science fiction, just in a way similar to fantasy genre, because operates or talks about abnormal things, or things that that are expected to happen in the future, so they don't belong to the real world. They are actually set in the future, science fiction, and involve the wonders of technology. Okay, fairy tales are shorter than most fantasy works. Okay, see the difference here. First one, need to compare to science fiction. As they talk about happenings that are outside of our normal world and expected to happen in the future. Okay, but they are not, of course, they don't discuss or talk about happenings in the real world. Okay, and they much involved in future technology. Fairy tales are shorter than most fantasy works. This is one difference compared to fantasy. Fairy tales compared to fantasy. Fairy tales are usually shorter. Characters, okay, of fairy tales and settings lack specificity. Okay, specificity, اللي هو being specific. Characters in fairy tales are not specific, like fantasy. You may find in fantasy stories specific names, places, time, not like fairy tales where things are general or obscure or not specific in terms of time, place, characters. Seldom are place names given or detailed descriptions of characters provided in fairy tales. Okay, nuances, okay, little differences, okay, little nuances and subtitles of portrayal are deliberately ignored, okay, in fairy tales, while you can find them in fantasy stories. Types of fantasies. Here we have also to remember these types of fantasy. There are 3 different ways that that fantasy writers set up their words. Okay, one, some novels begin and end in a fantasy world, like the Hobbit or Wizard of Earth Sea. Then others start in real world and move into fantasy world. Okay, this is type 2. First one, novels begin and end in fantasy world. Fantasy types. The first type fantasies, stories that start and end in fantasy world, not real at all, from the beginning to the end. Others, they start in real world and move into fantasy, like here Alice in Wonderland or Peter Pan. Then third type, fantasy is set in real world, but elements of magic intrude upon it. Okay, a fantasy that exists in real world, but what it includes, it has elements of magic and fantasy. And for example, we have Mary Poppins or David اللي هو Sickling by David Almonds. Realistic settings are often called primary words, like fantasy settings with secondary word. Realistic settings, okay, of the primary words, we have here fantasy settings with secondary word. Portals between words, اللي هو opening between words. Okay, protagonists usually cross some kind of opening or portal between the 2 words, اللي هو the word of reality and the word of fantasy, between the real world and the imaginative world. Okay, protagonists usually cross some kind of opening, some kind of portal between the 2 words. Examples we have here: The Lion, The Witch and the Wardrobe, Harry Potter books, Caroline, or Peter Pan. Now, why do writers use the fantasy word? What is it good for? What is it used? Okay, what could children or readers benefit from stories of fantasy genre? Okay, first major advantage, the major advantage of fantasy is that it can be open, up possibilities, which is really important, to open up possibilities of the word or of the thinking about the word. It is not confined, not limited, not restricted to the boundaries of the real world. Gives the children a chance to think about things outside the real world. Okay, outside the boundaries of the world, outside the limits, okay, of the real world. Think about other words that could exist. Just an idea, just to make children think, possibilities of, make things, open, I mean, possibilities open for, children to think about other, words if they exist. Writers are able to convey complex ideas on a symbolic level that would be difficult to convey otherwise. Okay, fantasy, again, this is third. Fantasy works can provide a fresh perspective on the real world, which is really important. Okay, next, fantasy stories can suggest universal truths through the use of magic and the supernatural. Okay, through magic and supernatural stories or events, they can suggest, universal truth about the real world. Next, if you have Thomas Hardy preferred fantasy over realism. Okay, this is here important. Thomas Hardy, as one of the writers, okay, and scholars, he prefers fantasy over realism. Stories that talk about real life, real people. Claiming that, why does he say that? Okay, claiming that, he claims a story must be exceptional enough to justify its telling, and that a writer must have something more unusual to relate than the ordinary experience of every average man and a woman. Okay, so we call it a class, and that's all for today. I hope that you enjoyed this lecture, and please, again and again, please contact me through my email in case of any question or any piece of information you need to know about the lectures, and then the final exam, of course. But we'll discuss final exam during the live sessions, okay? And I'll let you know what to concentrate on, okay? Of course, some students are, asking or complaining of, of too many names and dates, huh? Okay, I'll let you know about what could be more important than the other. Again, thank you very much, and hope to see you soon in our next class, next lecture. Assalamu alaikum.